In her introduction, Janneke Roos talked about also the educational activities of the foundation, and there are booklets on the table in the back, so please feel free to study them. The booklets are there, and can people take them?
Yeah.
For free?
For free.
For free. Just checking. And so, without further ado, we will continue with our wonderful and important morning program, the second session. And I'm not sure whether this was intentional or not. There is a gender divide. We had 2 male speakers, but we will now have 3 wonderful female speakers. And the first, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce her, is Ms. Stephanie Welvaart, who is a researcher at the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam, an important repository of archives, but also a very strong research institute. And she will talk about the importance of history, but also of storytelling, and the way that storytelling can sometimes be a means, a conduit, so to say, to heal from trauma, so sharing stories. And the title of her presentation is A Story Apart, Reconciliation Through Storytelling. So please join me in welcoming with an applause Ms. Stephanie Welvaart.
Thank you, Wim. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Today I want to speak about reconciliation, and not as something abstract or political, but as something intimate, lived, and intergenerational. According to the Merriam-Webster website, reconciliation means to restore to friendship or harmony. And if we follow this definition, it doesn't begin with peace treaties or governments, it begins with stories. And it's the stories we tell, but it's also the stories we actually don't tell. And we will explore this through 3 different interconnected levels. First is reconciliation within ourselves. Second is reconciliation within families, and the third is reconciliation in a wider society. And each level requires storytelling, I would say, but not just any story, and I will get back to that point later. Let's go to the next slide. In the past years, I was involved in several research programs in which storytelling took a central place. It was in conducting interviews, so oral history, and also collecting ego documents such as correspondences, diaries, memoirs. But we also looked at how stories are being told and how they are passed to different generations. And I will use some examples today under some pseudonyms from these projects. So just to give you a little bit of an idea where these stories were collected or shared, I will introduce the project. So one of them is Getuigen en Tijdgenoten, Witnesses and Contemporaries, and it was part of a research program on the Indonesian War of Independence and the violence, Dutch violence in this war. It was conducted by a collective of institutes, and we collected as a sub-project, we collected stories of people who experienced this period themselves. I was also involved in the research project Oorlog en Vrijheid in 3 generaties, so that translates as War and Freedom in 3 generations, by the Nationaal Comité 4 en 5 mei. In this project, multiple generations within families were interviewed about the Second World War, all in the Netherlands. And one project focused specifically on Indonesia, dus the war in Indonesia. And it did cover a longer time period, so it was focused, or it started in the Second World War. But we also realized very soon that that type of frame wasn't really complete for the people who experienced that period. For example, also the National Revolution was very important, or migration and the years in the Netherlands, all connected to the Second World War. And going back to general colonialism. And the last project is a research project about dialogue and how grassroots organizations feel about the need to organize dialogue, go into dialogue. And the project followed the recommendations from the report Deel en Verbind. It's from the, I will say it in English, the Committee for Strengthening Knowledge of the History of the Former Dutch Indies. So let's begin at the most personal level. Can you go to the next slide, please? Reconciliation within ourselves. Reconciliation often starts with a moment of emotional confrontation. For example, when someone allows themselves to really feel the story they've long tried to suppress. And I want to share a quote from an interview with Charles, a so-called second generation Malaccan man born in a Malaccan camp in Zeeland a few years after his parents made their way to the Netherlands. And with the risk, a little bit of simplifying his story, just a little bit more context. He, as a child, was raised in that particular camp, and for him it was one big playground. So initially he had very positive feelings about it, but then he soon realized that his parents and other adults in the camp were actually going through very tough times. He himself was raised in quite a strict manner. His father was a military man who valued discipline and order. At age 55, his unspoken anger caught up with him, so he went to therapy. And I will read this quote from an interview we had with him. I wrote it all down, everything that was bothering me, without emotion. I read it again and thought, yeah. So I took it to the psychologist and said, well, I wrote it here, and he opens it, closes it again, gives it back. Go ahead, read it out loud. I said, why? I know what it says. Just try reading it. So I started reading. I was in the middle of a sentence and it started to flow, the tears. Even though when I wrote it down, it was all rational. But the moment he said, now read it out loud, I read the whole story through tears. And then it was done. Then it was over. I could give it a place. So this is reconciliation in a very raw form, I would say. Not just recalling the past, but feeling it and holding it and letting it transform him. And for Charles, this shift opened the door to talking more openly to his family members about his family's past and also about his father and the impact his father had on his life. On the next slide, we see a different form of inner reckoning. It's a testimony of Willem. It's a Dutch conscript born in 1925 in Amsterdam. And he served in North Sumatra during the Indonesian War of Independence. And I will share his quote. We arrived at a kampong and came under fire. We were lying in a trench. The sergeant said, Van Breen, mortar fire. So I went onto the road, crouching, and fired 15 to 20 mortar bombs into the kampong. Later, when we entered the kampong, I saw the effect. They were civilians. As far as they were men, I could be at peace with that. That's guerrilla warfare. But women and children, a mortar bomb doesn't just make a little hole. They were all dead. Well, there was nothing we could do. So in this quote, you see both regret and justification come into play, while he's shifting his responsibility to others, to the orders he got, to the circumstances he was in. So on the one hand, his remorse is deeply felt. So he's really talking about killing civilians, he also is also framed by limits. So at one point, he's talking about that, and on the other hand, he says, but there was nothing we could do. And I think this is where personal reconciliation is very complex, because it really moves between sorrow on the one hand and self-defense on the other. On the next slide, there's a quote from another Dutch veteran, that's Gerrit. So he signed up as one of the first war volunteers. So for him, that's a very important fact, that he was a volunteer. He was eager to go, and as he pointed out himself, at the end of 1945, they arrived in Tanjung Priok, the harbor near Jakarta. And he recalled different moments in which he committed war crimes. And he calls them explicitly war crimes himself. And one of them was in Kampung, close to Purwokerto, where they drove people out of their houses, but didn't actually check if everyone was gone. So then we burned these houses. At the time, it didn't really bother me. It was just another task. But now it's regret and shame. And later in the interview, who knows? Maybe I burned them alive, people. Well, is that a war crime or is that not a war crime? So what stands out here for me is the evolution of feelings over time. So only many years later, he was actually around the age of 80, he started to share his stories and talked about regretting his actions, calling them war crimes. And he did not only speak to his family, but he really felt the need to bring it out there to a larger audience. So that's why he contacted us at the Contemporaries and Witnesses Project to make sure people would hear him. Let's continue to the next level. Reconciliation within families. Abdul Wahid already spoke a little bit about it, or a lot. Families and their stories are where history comes together, very close. But family stories are often incomplete. That's also what came up before. They're distorted by trauma, sometimes by silence or by generational shift. And I want to show the example of Jos. Jos was born in Malang in 1924 as the sixth of 11 children. And his father was a strict KNIL officer who was gelijkgesteld, but did not hold Dutch citizenship. So both of his parents came from the Minahasa region, and both of Jos's grandfathers had served in the KNIL. So just as a little background, they lived in a neighborhood alongside Indo-Europeans and affluent Indonesians, and there was a separate European district and a kampung where the Indonesians lived, and he, in his own words, said they formed sort of like a buffer. He offers quite a complex reflection on his role during the Second World War. So I quote, "The Japanese were not the enemy for us Indonesians, because they came with the message, we have liberated you from the Europeans, and we are one big family, Greater Asia. At a certain point, I actually felt like a bit of a traitor, because I had also been part of the resistance, even though I was Indonesian. But the doctrine of my father, a KNIL soldier, and the loyalty of my brother to Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch royal family were so strong, it became something I was obliged to take part in. So as a child of a KNIL soldier, I couldn't say I hadn't done nothing." So this quote shows emotional conflict, conflicting loyalties, and also how social expectations really moved him in a certain direction. And it really tells us something that most history books don't. It's really how people navigate impossible situations in wartime. But what I noticed in that particular research, that this nuance doesn't always survive across generations. So in the next slide, we can see a quote of his son, Karel. So he was interviewed in the same project, and he was given a question what he knew about his father's experiences during the war, and he gave a much simpler account. "My father wasn't enthusiastic about the Indonesian struggle, probably out of self-protection. He was Dutch-oriented because of my mother's family." So that's quite concise. And even though social expectations do come to the fore in his recollection, issues of conflicting loyalties and emotional conflict are shown a lot less, and what is left is just a more tidy explanation of the situation. It's maybe easier to carry, maybe easier to tell other people about, but in a way is emptier in meaning. So by the third generation, we all also interviewed them. In the next slide, you see Jos's granddaughter, Esther, and she's also being asked about what memories she knows or got told by her grandparents. And then she says, as if it just didn't exist. Maybe it's a very indistinct thing. We simply don't talk about it. So I don't know whether it was traumatic for my grandparents. It just never came up. And this illustrates a wider pattern coming to light in their research, like the deep reflective storytelling of the first generation. It really fades over time, so it really waters down. It becomes more abstract, it becomes fragmented, or even silenced altogether, so memories disappear. And yet, storytelling within families or larger communities, and then I would say not necessarily limited to parents and children and the communication between them, but also looking at larger communities. They do, if you collect in different places, if you hear stories from different people and maybe about the same person, it can work complementary. They do sometimes reveal the complexity of people and their experiences and the situations they were in. In the next slide, we see a quote of Masora. It's a grandson of a respected Malaccan Kneel soldier, as he would say it himself. He shares how his childhood image of his grandfather had changed. He didn't talk about the killings, but we did find out he was very cruel. I heard from other grandfathers that you had to lick the blood of your parang so you wouldn't fear your enemy. As a kid, though, I thought, wow, what a hero. He told me the softer side of the story, but now I see the harder parts too. So he really, through his family, but not even his family, through his social environment, he heard different stories and really managed to get a more complete image than he got from just listening to his father. So let's now move to the societal level, where reconciliation happens in schools and museums and commemorations. On the next slide, you see the quote of Maya, among others. Yes. So for many years, reconciliation between the Netherlands and Indonesia and Japan was very much centered on World War II and its aftermath, logically, maybe. But for younger generations, that's no longer enough if they talk about dialogue. As Maya, a young facilitator of dialogue-based events, shared with us, she said, we've noticed that different generations have different needs when it comes to topics that deserve more attention. Young people, for example, want to place more focus on the pre-colonial period. And I think there's still a lot of processing need for many first generations. And young people are also interested in the lives of their ancestors before the war. In the interview project, it popped up more often that the focus needs to be expanded if it will be up to the next generations, the younger generations. Not only backward to include the whole of colonialism, but also forward to address its ongoing consequences. And as Gina, in the next slide, she's a developer of educational programs, and she stated, you can explain racism and discrimination very effectively through this history, but that opportunity is not being taken. So there is a call for a broader intersectional memory culture, and one participant urged us to, for example, also reflect on gender roles in colonialism. Another mentioned queerness in the pre-colonial Indonesian archipelago and how colonial rule suppressed it. And another person linked it to climate change and the long history of colonial extraction. So a much wider, and as Thomas, brings it actually quite well together. He's an organizer of Second World War commemoration. He shares that, I hope that's where we're heading, that intersection is the core. All the problems we're facing on Earth, they're all connected, the link between past, present, and future. So this is really a call to transform remembrance and not just revisit the Second World War, but to see if how it's part of a much longer history of domination and displacement and resistance. And you could say then that reconciliation doesn't only mean acknowledgement of what has happened, but more importantly, it means structural awareness that really goes, it really works up until now. So what can we take from all of this? In the next slide, I share my sort of conclusion. So on a personal level, storytelling helps people make sense of trauma. They can come to terms with their action and live more honestly with the past. Within families, it's a way to pass down not just what had happened, but also the emotions, choices, contradictions, and silences that shape those experiences. And for society as a whole, storytelling creates room to move. It creates room to move beyond Second World War focused narratives and opening really the door to a broader and deeper reckoning of colonial history and its ongoing impact. And I guess, you see on the next slide, more importantly, reconciliation depends not just only on telling stories, but it depends on telling the rich kind of stories. And what I mean by that is, it depends on telling stories that are not easy or heroic. Stories that show complexity and contradiction. And stories that include doubt, regret, loyalty struggles, moral uncertainty. And so, to be short, stories that are not clean and resolved. And that is precisely why they are so valuable. And I think telling complex stories is not a threat to reconciliation. It's really the very foundation of it. And it really allows us to see not just what happened, so what you could call the facts, but why people did what they did. It's not only showing what was suffered, which is also very, very important, but it also shows what was struggled with. It can help us make sense of and respond to actions, or response to the situation in today's world, and really take actions. And I think that we are in a world now where we are faced with discrimination, violence, war, and even genocide is ongoing. And I think the power of these stories is to help us deal with what is happening right now. So how to get there? In the next slide, I share some ideas. It's definitely not complete, but just some ideas. I think it's really important to treasure first-generation oral history. There's so many rich interviews available, and even if it's not about or from your own family members, it can be so enriching to just hear about what other people went through in the same area, in the same time period, or maybe in a completely different position, opposite position maybe. I also think it's important to being aware of the impact of the context in which a story is shared. So we really notice that in these interviews that, it does matter a lot who is sitting in front of the person who's sharing a story. So it's an intergenerational thing. Some family members don't want to burden their children or their grandchildren. And also just what is shared with whom, in the sense of sometimes a stranger, as in an interviewer or just a stranger, is more easy to just give your all. And I think it's important to put stories together, and I think a day like this does that really well. And not only putting them side by side and hopping from one to the other, but really trying to make, I say let them talk, but I don't know if that makes sense. It made sense to me, but really try to see where they connect and where they disconnect, to place them in the same moment, for example, or in the same area, or really to try to make a whole. And lastly, make intergenerational talks happen, specifically on subjects like resilience, choice, responsibility, solidarity, and action. And I think different generations can learn a lot from each other, young generations from the experiences of older generations, and older generations from the more modern wisdoms of the younger generation. And then I want to end my talk with a question that you can bring home, or maybe you can bring into the afternoon. What is a story you carry that has no answers, easy answers, or has no simple message? And what would happen if you told it as it really is? And then I was triggered by my own use of really, because we talked about it just before the break, that what is real, if it comes to memories, like is it factual or not? And I think what I actually mean is not what it really is, but more showing the complexity, and in that sense, how make it more truthful. If that is more logic, if that makes more sense. And I think just to come back to the point about the factualness of these oral histories and the issues. Personally, also, like, is my memory actually, is it correct? And also generally, maybe for writing history. I think what stories really do, they can be very useful for writing history and hearing other stories and finding out, okay, so maybe it happened differently And then you can figure out with different sources, like, okay, so did this happen, did this not happen? But what I think is more interesting, and we really shouldn't forget about that, is that these memories that people have, even if they're not factual or true, they do have an impact on that person's life. And it does have a very big impact too on the next generation. So in that sense, it's always real. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for complicating things and also bringing out this very important intergenerational dimension, the wonderful quotes that undoubtedly resonated with many of us, either out of recognition or because they triggered new questions, and it is very apt that you end with questions because this is definitely an ongoing conversation. Now, there will be a Q&A after our three speakers have concluded their presentations. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Ms. Belinda Bernard, who is an independent scholar, researcher, and writer, and who has recently published, I think, again, an important book, A Gate in the Wall, Pacific Wars, POW, Secret Diary, and Family Path, this is my age and my eyesight, towards reconciliation. I'm very happy that she's here with us, and thank you very much for taking the trouble. Also, there is a glass of water set for you, and please give her a warm welcome, Ms. Belinda Bernard.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to Janneke Rose and the Dialogue Steering Committee for this opportunity to speak to you. I want to begin by taking you back to a time 25 years ago when, in August 2000, Wim Lindeyer Jr. stood before the very first conference of this dialogue. At that time, the Dialogue Netherlands-Japan. He held in his hands, do we have slides? He held in his hands this publication of the POW diary of his father, Wim Lindeyer Sr., a World War II prisoner in Japan. Okay. The diary's entries were actually the letters that the senior Lindeyer had never stopped writing, but as a prisoner was never able to mail to his wife and 4 children who were interned in Java. The volume that Wim Jr. held had just been published with the help of Professor Takemitsu Muraoka and actually led to holding the conference. It had been published in Japanese at the urging of the Japanese community in Delft and citizens in Kamaishi, Japan. Only published in Japanese, never in Dutch or any other language. Included with it was the farewell letter that Lindeyer's wife, Nell, had dictated 2 days before her internment camp death. You can see the volume enlarged on the screen before you now, as it was released by a leading Japanese publisher, Misuzu Shobo, in 2000, entitled in translation, Kisses to Nell and the Children from a POW camp in Japan. I first had the opportunity to read the diary in rough English translation in 2003. Japanese media had already featured it in numerous positive reviews. And by 2005, students in Kamaishi, Japan, near the former prison, had read it during a 2-year program in their school. They responded remarkably with a dramatic reenactment, a student play that balanced empathy for Lindeyer and his fellow prisoners with empathy for their own town, which I learned that my country had shelled. What was it, I began wondering, that accounted for the positive attention that this particular POW diary was receiving in Japan in the 21st century? The response seemed counterintuitive. The letter entries recorded traumatic wartime situations. What was it like to be a medic in the midst of gunfire and bombing during the 1942 Dutch defense of Java? What was it like to attempt to minister to the sick and dying in the hold of a hell ship during a months-long journey from Java to Japan? What was it like to survive 3 years in a mining camp in the mountains of northeast Honshu? Above all, what was it like to experience all of this while worried sick about the wife and 4 children left behind? The eldest of Lindeer's 4 children was 6 years old when he was captured. The youngest was 18 months. What, I wondered, could possibly have been the attraction? It took a long time to find out, but after immersing myself not only in the diary, but then in the records of Lindeer's fellow prisoners, I think I know. From the very beginning of his imprisonment, Lindeer began developing an entire set of coping techniques that enabled him to work through the trauma he was experiencing and achieve a degree of calm. As a result, he became almost a singular figure in his prison for rationality. First and foremost among these coping techniques was the diary itself. We see his reliance on the diary, perhaps most dramatically during his transport to Japan. Imagine him crammed along with 1,200 other POWs like cargo into an old troop transport with 1,000 returning Japanese troops. The POWs lie virtually on top of one another in tiers of shelves in the ship's suffocating holds, barely enough room to sit up. The 500 in Lindeer's group have to climb a 40-foot ladder up the hatch of their hold to reach WCs hanging over the edge of their ship. Their food, insufficient, is lowered in buckets through the same hatch. Remarkably, in the hold's faint lighting, he addresses letter entries to his family. The very act of writing distances him from the circumstances he's writing about, allowing him to evaluate his situation more calmly. Mentally, he's in their living room, telling them factually so as not to alarm them what he's experiencing. In doing so, he achieves a more factual, rational grasp of his situation himself. Rhetorically, he's assuring the family that despite being carried far away, he's maintaining the identity that he's always had with them. He continues to be their husband and father. From the depths of the ship, he expresses hope that Herman, his next eldest, is still going to preschool. He wonders how Vim Jr. is doing in 2nd grade, and he tells Nell that he has every confidence that she will get through this, signing his entries, kisses from father and Vim, kisses from father and husband, your loving Vim. In fact, his rhetorical device is an effective coping mechanism. In reassuring them, he's strengthening his own belief that despite his loss of freedom, he remains himself. But Lindeer is not only determined to retain his family role, his entries likewise show his determination to hold on to his identity as a highly educated scientist with a passion for learning and teaching. Even prior to the transport, as a POW in Java and no longer able to communicate with his family, he reports a host of educational activities. He has found someone to teach him Latin. When possible, he's giving lectures to his fellow POWs on topics like the forces between small particles. He's learning Japanese For some POWs, this is a disloyal activity. For Lindeyer, the scientist, it's knowledge that can help him with rational grasp of his situation. Once at the camp in Japan, Lindeyer records sadness over the 30 prisoners who died on the ship. This is mingled with fear over the cases of dysentery, pneumonia, and even diphtheria in the present. He himself nearly dies, yet within a short time, he's keeping up his educational activities, learning the Japanese characters for writing, and writing a basic chemistry course in English after first finding someone who can help him practice that language. He's also showing his family's photograph. Cue. Yeah, thank you. He's showing his family's photograph to any patient who is well enough to talk. I just have to interject here. During my visit a few years ago to a former sailor of the USS Houston, I had carried the volume of the Japanese version of the diary with me. Jack Feliz pointed across the room to the volume and said, "I think I've seen that picture before." By the one-year anniversary of his imprisonment, the balance that Lindeyer has achieved leads to an important change. His diary up to now has been an escape hatch of sorts from a squalid present to the safe haven of pages where it's as though he's at home with his family, telling them bits and pieces of his experience. For his anniversary entry, he resolves to make the door on the hatch swing the other way. Rather than retreating to the past, he'll bring the family fully into his present by relating his experience during an entire single day. The day he describes includes everything, down to the earthy details of his helping a bedridden patient occupy his throne, so to speak, as various sounds are produced. Not coincidentally, within the single-day entry, we find that overnight, and almost without realizing it, Lindeyer has taken on a new camp identity. His new group of British and American friends have seen fit to rename him Lindy. "Lindy, give me the pan, please," he quotes the bedridden British prisoner as saying, and then, "Take me off, Lindy." From the start, the name implies familiarity, a tendency of the English speakers to identify him, to associate him with aspects of their own experience, Lucky Lindy and the Lindy Hop. Now, just an aside here. When I visited the former prisoner, Jack Feliz, he did not remember anybody named Lindeyer, but he instantly remembered Lindy. "He sewed up my foot once." From the date of the single day onward, Lindeyer is no longer finding it necessary to root himself so entirely within the confines of the diary. By bringing the family, even rhetorically, into his everyday, and by accepting his new name, he's effectively coming to terms with this camp situation. Without diminishing his identity as Vim, he is finding that he can also be Lindy. The records of Lindeyer's colleagues show him embarking on a new and expanded role in the prison at this point. His coping skills now allow him to be fully integrated with the present. Americans James Reynolds and Bill Stewart, sailors off the Houston, cite Lindy's bringing uplift to sick prisoners, sharing food, solving problems, and managing to resolve disputes. Keith Edmonds of the Royal Australian Air Force tells of Lindy's teaching algebra. Kenneth Horne of the British Royal Air Force of his teaching a differential and integral calculus course that he has written himself. He's also teaching young Japanese math. Note what is happening here. Lindeyer's educational activities are beneficial not only to himself, They provide moments of calm rationality to his fellow prisoners as well. More than this, he as teacher and they as students are likely elevating their professional prospects for after the war. This gives them an additional and valuable coping capability, hope. But even more than the new name, Lindeyer's Single Day introduces a new and unexpected figure, a civilian Japanese camp employee, precisely at the day's center. This civilian employee, Iroe Iwashita, is an aspiring novelist with a degree in English, but he's had to put his aspirations aside for his wartime assignment as the liaison between the camp's prisoners and its administration. He stops in often at the camp's hospital to practice his English and French with Lindeyer and a fellow medic. That fellow medic has some relatives sitting in the back. For Lindeyer, the liaison situation resonates. Iwashita's life, like his own, has been turned on end. And though he spends most of his time at the camp, he has a wife and 2 children and a home in Tokyo. Recognition of mutual concerns stimulates empathy and middle ground between the 2 men. When Lindeyer is asked by camp officials to write about his experience during the war, including his worst experience, evidence suggests that Iwashita meets with him afterwards for a personal conversation about it. And when Lindeyer is transferred from the hospital to the camp's electrical workshop, the liaison stops in there as well. In the workshop's greater seclusion, Iwashita, Lindeyer, and a handful of others engage in something very like dialogue. Though consistently loyal to his country, Iwashita has become critical of its militarized government. If they could read my thoughts, I would be executed. From Lindeyer's colleagues, we gain the sense of his being an influencer, held in certain regard, even by the camp's administration. Reporting an episode in which most would have been punished, Lindeyer is merely chided. His fellow colleagues consider it Lindy's luck. But far more than from luck, his role as influencer arises from coping skills that allow him sufficient calm to have empathy when appropriate for Iwashita and others. Lindeyer wasn't alone in this, of course. There were other POWs who saw shades of gray, who noted good guards, and even hated to see ones they liked sent off to the war. But in his diary, Lindeyer is consistent in building on empathy and mutual concerns to suspend judgment and listen for a while. He recognizes that Iwashita does not see the world through the same lens that he does, but he is hardly the other. He is someone whose otherness can be respected and whose photograph deserves to be stored in the diary next to the photograph of Lindeyer's family. And it's right here that we arrive at the transgenerational influence in the diary. It's important to note that the senior Lindeyer experienced his trauma as an adult in real-world situations, whereas his eldest son, Wim Jr., experienced his trauma as a child and internalized it in a way that was inexpressible. But we will see that he found ways to begin to decipher it. Wim Jr., I'll call him Wim, grew to adulthood in the Netherlands and became a civil engineer with a PhD posted to water and sanitation projects in undeveloped countries. Reading the diary briefly as a teenager, he had discovered the photograph of a Japanese man in what looked to be army clothes, next to that of himself and his mother and siblings, and he found it disturbing. But his father had told him to put the diary aside until later, and over the years it had just settled into the back of his mind. Until 1992, that is, when a tragic event, the murder of 14 of his aid worker acquaintances, were murdered at the Khyber Pass. This caused him to suffer a breakdown. The event was devastating in itself, but it brought back the traumatic memory of attacks at another pass long ago, when the Allied truck convoy liberating him and his siblings met the fire of Indonesian independence fighters. The real subject of his breakdown was Central Java in 1945, not Pakistan in 1992. Rereading the diary in hopes of learning his father's coping strategies seemed the only possible therapy. He began putting the letters on an old second-hand computer. Yet his work with the diary caused flashbacks to the events of his childhood. Reliving them made him feel uncertain and caused trembling all over his body. In the psychiatrist's terms, this was his traumatic affect, in which the initial numbing experience that caused the trauma has never been fully processed rationally. And because of that, it repeatedly and insistently comes back. But Wim continued to believe that examining his memories in light of his father's diary would surely help. His father had expressed well wishes for his family while in the company of dying men in a derelict ship. The very act of writing might have held terror at length to allow him to think more objectively and do what he could to improve things. Later, when asked by the camp's administration to report on his worst wartime experience, he managed to do so in a rational and controlled voice that they could understand. The task that Wim set for himself, reading his father's letters and putting them on a computer, might work in a similar way. Confronting his own experience within the larger framework of his father's document might help with the distance and objectivity that he himself needed. The diary's factual approach stimulated him to search for facts and data of his own. He began attending the camp reunions that sprang up in the 1980s in the Netherlands. The reunions provided an opportunity that was otherwise missing for former internees to compare notes and exchange information. Wim pored over the reunion tables full of diaries, maps, and photos, finding it strangely exciting to get a clearer adult access to the events of his childhood. But a particular memory of his mother's last words in a camp when he was 9 gave him great difficulty. Distraught over her final illness, he had vowed that he would fight the Japanese for her when he grew up. She drew herself up on her sickbed and gasped, "No!" That was the last thing he should do. Hatred was what caused war. With hatred, he would never be able to love. Nonetheless, he had never been able to separate his grief over her from his bitterness toward the Japanese and his bitterness toward himself. Had he helped her more in the camp, would she have lived? Whoops. The same conflict held him captive as an adult. He found that it only became worse as he moved forward in the diary to his father's letter of the single day. The single day would almost certainly have been a composite of many days. How could it be that his father had positioned a visit from one of his captors prominently at the center? The letter suggested that his father had developed a close relationship with this man, no doubt the same whose photograph perplexed him as a young teenager. Wim's long-held notion of the Japanese as the monstrous other of his nightmares was being challenged. But he was bothered by another memory as well, a remarkable premonitory dream that he had in his first camp as a child. In the dream, he and his siblings were guided by an unknown lady through a gate into a courtyard of fountains and flowers. He had been troubled by the dream's conflicting suggestions of an escape. That would be the apparent security of the garden and the guiding figure of the lady, and his also suggestion of a trap. That would be the ominous absence of his mother. But his mother had told him not to worry, it was only a dream. It's just that it proved to be more than that. In the dream, the courtyard was surrounded by a massive building built against a slope, with outdoor staircases interrupted by terraces on either side. He had felt compelled to explore and had run up along the staircases to a terrace with a pool of goldfish and water lilies. Lying on his stomach, he stared, mesmerized by the fish. Then, continuing on, he passed through a doorway into a garden and via another door through a wall. On the other side, he was delighted to find that he could jump down to a nearly dry stream bed and follow it around all the way to the gate where he had entered and joined the others. Then the dream ended, preventing him from seeing more. He had forgotten such things by late May 1945, when they were transferred to the third camp, Muntalan. His mother was already ill and had to be carried aboard the train on a stretcher. He and his siblings traveled with a friend, Mrs. Marine, and arrived at the camp ahead of her. The camp was an enormous Roman Catholic seminary built out of stone against a lower slope of Mount Merapi. In spite of his overcrowded conditions, he had been struck as they entered the main gate by the existence of a garden and ran exhilarated up a series of stairs in search of more such oases. Coming upon an old swimming pool, he lay on his stomach, watching orange carp swim under plant debris. And only when he heard a pursuing guard did he recall, just in time, that he needed to run to the right, through a doorway, into a garden, to another door, through a wall. Over the years, he had asked himself whether the parallel of dream and experience was no more than a bizarre set of coincidences. Yet the dream continued its hold on him and was clearly a part of his traumatic effect, as evidenced by his having returned to it often during the family's post-war sharing. More fact-seeking proved crucial to his process of deciphering it. In early 1995, he attended a speech about the Battle of Ambarawa by a Dutch military historian, Petra Hroen. Wim hoped it would provide a more accurate understanding of the chaotic period of the liberation of the camps and his own experience as the truck convoy carrying him and his siblings headed for the harbor in Semarang through the Gumbel Pass. What he was astonished to learn about was the remarkable heroism of a certain Japanese major, Kido Shinichiro. For 5 days in October 1945, Major Kido had led his unit in heavy fighting to put an end to the violent attacks on the former civilian internees by Indonesian insurgents and to regain control of Semarang and the Ambarawa camps. His efforts saved thousands of European lives at the cost of 200 Japanese lives. Wim was struck with the realization that hundreds of Japanese, the same people he had held responsible for his mother's death, had died fighting to save me. His concept of the Japanese as the evil pursuing other of his nightmares, first challenged by his father's friendship with Iwashita, was no longer tenable. Let's have another drink. Yet even now, he had not thoroughly grasped the dream. A question raised by a friend upon hearing it once again helped him decipher it. Had he seen any connection between the Three Worlds print that he'd never failed to mention seeing at the psychiatrist's office and the fish of the camp and the dream? Wim was stunned, saying that he had never consciously analyzed the print, yet the possible subconscious associations left him speechless. Escher had his own traumatic memories of the war Wim knew. Perhaps as a result, Escher had worked through the perceptual problems that accompany the binary concept of an other in the Three Worlds print. That the large fish with bulging eyes was somewhere in his awareness when he learned about Major Kiddo made sense to Wim. The fish surely represented one world, and the trees another. But what was the third? The leaves floating on the water's surface, barely existent middle territory? In relation to Major Kiddo's story, the three worlds might have been the Japanese, Wim himself, and the Ambarawa area of the camps where the Major took risks in his behalf. Wim began to consider whether Escher's treatment of perceptual problems might shed light on the premonitory dream and the related events at Muntalan. The stairways and terraces that he had navigated to circle the camp stone structure resembled the eerie architecture of another of Escher's prints, titled Ascending and Descending. In this print, monks climb up and down a series of staircases in a closed system. Wim's own route in the dream and in reality consisted of the same continuous loop. Running from the guard had seemed an escape, his hope as a child for a happy ending. It had actually prevented him from coming to terms with his own trauma and repeatedly brought him back to his own bitter hatred. Now, in an intuitive leap, Wim realized that in the symbolic terms of the dream, he had to turn and face the pursuing other. To find a true gate through the wall, he had to go to Japan. He had to engage the Japanese. And as fitting, during his first 1995 trip to Kamaishi, Japan, his father's diary traveled with him, held close like a suit of armor. Yet when a reporter asked what was in the bag, Wim found himself opening it almost without thought and revealing the diary's pages to the reporter. In the days that followed, he toured the former camp and the mine. Once again, he was revisiting his father's experience, but this time he was discussing it with Kamaishi citizens in the present. The following year, before a student audience in Kamaishi, he confessed the hatred he had had for them as a result of his mother's death. And then he asked their forgiveness. In a rational manner they could understand, he conveyed both his anguish over her loss and his desire to reach out to them. From what I've said about citizens in Kamaishi pressing for the publication of the diary in Japanese, you effectively know the rest. They had their own trauma because of their city's bombardment. Yet out of empathy, they took Wim's lead in seeking accurate historical understanding of their past. Their efforts to gain access to the diary were influential in the establishment of this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very reflexive and deep reading of this extraordinary diary and the life story, basically, of both father and son in their journey towards reconciliation, so to say. Without further ado, because we are a bit behind when it comes to our time schedule, but content always takes precedence presidents over time, I always say. I would like to introduce Dr. Ernestine Hoege, who is a biographer, a writer, translator, and editor. And Dr. Hoege has analyzed the culture of a network of remembrance of the Kaimoka POW camp in Japan. So the survivors and how this network also works towards reconciliation. So coming back to Stephanie's lecture, we are navigating between these different levels of basically memories and operating memories. So Ernestine, the floor is yours. Yes.
Can you, start it from the beginning. Can you do spill off? That we have the whole screen, do you know what I mean? Yes. Yes, thank you, great. And there's a lot of changes, so I'm going to annoy you by the time I've finished. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Wim and Janneke and the whole committee for inviting me to speak today. It's a great honor. I've given this presentation the name Moving Forward from the Network of Remembering of Kamioka POW Camp, but perhaps a better title would have been Looking Forward or Looking to the Future from Within the Network of Remembering of Kamioka POW Camp. And the main question that I will address in this talk is it possible to not forget the past, yet at the same time to look forward towards the future, to make a conscious effort to open our vision to the future as we remember the past. And in the margin, I will perhaps also touch on the unclear boundaries between aggressor, victim, guilt, pain, suffered, pain inflicted, which has come to the fore in all the other presentations and which is a difficult subject. Perhaps it will feature in the margin. Please, the first, next slide. I would like to first take you back to the past in order to be able to look at the future towards the end of the presentation. And I would like to take you to this location on Honshu Island in Japan. The red dot, it's to the north of Takayama, and it's 1,600 meters up in the mountains. And this is the site of the next slide, please. Of this particular camp. This is a sketch made by one of the former POWs, a Dutch POW called Ben Ruffan. Kamioka POW camp, it had many names: Osaka, Kamioka branch camp, Osaka 7B, Nagoya 1B, doesn't matter. I would just refer to it as Kamioka, which is what the POWs also use as the name. Very briefly, opened in December 42, liberated in 45, 335 Dutch and Indo-European POWs were held here, 6 English or British POWs, 350 men from the United States. And all these men worked in the lead and the zinc mine. That was the reason for this camp. It was a labor camp to provide lead for the batteries, etc., of submarines, and a total of 85 men were eventually to die, which is 14% of the camp population. Now, my interest in this camp arose from research I was doing for a biography on one of the former inmates, a lawyer who was eventually involved in the Jungschläger-Schmidt trials in the 1950s in Indonesia, well-known political trials. And I later found out that the youngest brother of my grandmother was actually also interned in this camp, but I didn't know that at the time that I visited it. Next slide, please, another tap. To look at everything that I collected during this research for this biography, all about this Kamioka camp, which touched me in some profound way, I found it really useful to look at the work of Pierre Nora. First of all, memory is not the same as history. History is a reconstruction. This is what I did in the biography. I reconstructed events in the camp. It is the reconstruction of what is no longer. It's a representation of the past. It's an intellectual process. It's secular. It's about analysis, it's about criticism, it's about examining sources, checking facts, and it lays a claim to universal authority. It's literal and it's rational. Memory, on the other hand, is life. It's something you experience in your body. It seems like a mental process, but memory also has smells, images, sounds. Memory can be triggered by smells, by images, by sounds. And it's also open to remembering and forgetting and change. It's vulnerable to manipulation and appropriation. It can lie long dormant, we heard that in Melinda's story, and then be periodically revived. So it's a very different phenomenon, and it's a bond tying us to the eternal present. Now, I'm particularly interested in where can we find these memories? What triggers these memories? Where can we meet? And that's in the concept that Nora has described, sites of memory, or lieux de mémoire. I'm no expert on memory, that's Stephanie, so I'll just touch on it briefly, but I find this very helpful. This is spaces, it's objects, it's rituals, commemoration activities are sites of memory, where memories come to the fore, are worked through, are perhaps changed, are practiced, and they can be material or non-material, even symbolic. And I will give examples of sites of memory of this particular camp that I'm so interested in as we go along. Next one, please. What I also find very helpful is this work by Kyoko Murakami and David Middleton on networks of remembering. And very briefly, they too say that society is not just an interaction between humans, but it's also humans and the non-material world, different objects. It's hybrid. And I find this particularly useful in trying to sort through all the elements of a network of remembrance around a particular camp. It's not just physical sites, it's also practices, and the whole thing together is alive, can change. You can bring it together, you can choose, you can filter, you can leave behind, and you can move on. So these are the two terms that I've been working with in some of the publications I've written on Kamioka. Next one, please. Here is a picture at Liberation in 45. Note the stone parapet on which the barracks are placed. And in the next picture, this is a sketch of what the camp layout looked like, just to give a brief impression. And next one, please. This is what the camp looked like when I visited it on 11th April 2016. Note the stone parapet. So the barracks are gone, but the place is still, it resounds. When you stand there and you're familiar with all the diaries and the books and the histories and the memories people have talked about, and you stand there, then this is such a potent site of memory. The whole area, actually, the mountains, the sky. The POWs write in their diaries about the sky and the mountains and the colours and the seasons, and when you stand there you can actually see and feel it. And of course it was cherry blossom time when I was there in April, so it was absolutely mesmerising. Next slide, please. So, sites of memory, physical sites, obviously. If you can just touch them as I go along. The former campsite, I've just shown you that. You can see along a path an entrance to a mine where the men had to work. That evokes all kinds of associations and memories. There's the house of one of the former guards, which I was allowed to visit with the people who travelled with me, where prisoners were taken and actually fed and allowed to rest under the guise of being put to work. There's a farm where they went to do reclamation work, where they were also allowed to rest and eat. And very potent sites of memory are, of course, cemeteries. And if you click on the next one, this is Menteng Pulo in Jakarta, in Indonesia. This is where the Dutch POWs who died in Kamioka, their ashes are interred. The British men who died in Kamioka, their ashes are in Yokohama. And the American ashes were taken back to the US after the war, so they are dispersed across America. It gives an impression of how broad this network of remembrance can be, how far you have to go to put it all together. Next picture, please. This is another site of memory, not far from the camp, and this is a special site, I think, because the POWs also were familiar with this temple site and write about it in their diaries. It's a small 400-year-old complex. The present building is 100 years old. And you can see a cenotaph. The tall needle on the right of the center was actually erected by a local Japanese man. And on it, it says, "Cenotaph for the martyrs of the Kamioka prisoner of war detachment." So this was a Japanese man honoring the POWs who died. This is not a Dutch, American, English, or European initiative. It's a local initiative. And on it, there's also a Buddhist philosophy that says that all those who have fallen in war, regardless of whose side they are on, are to be remembered. So this cenotaph stands for a recognition of a shared wartime experience of loss and grief. On the next slide, you can see another fascinating thing, and that's what I call a book of the names of the dead. This is in a box in the temple of the ground I just showed you. And this again was produced by a local Japanese citizen. And in it, he wrote the names of every single known local soldier who died in the wars after Japan's Meiji Restoration in 1868. And he also, in the next slide, included one back, please, just one back. One more. That's an appendix with all the names of the POWs, so the American and European POWs who died in the camp. Again, the initiative of this man, he himself inscribed all these names secretly from the death certificates. I find these fascinating sites of memory. And on the next page, you can see where all the local Japanese soldiers since 1868 died. And this was so astonishing when this was opened as I visited that site. On the next site, my personal fascination is always with diaries. That was my original research interest. I won't go into them, but there are 6 known diaries and journalists who have survived from Kamioka, 4 Dutch, an English, and an American one. And they are what Philippe Lejeune would call crisis diaries, and Melinda's already talked a lot about the value of diaries and what they can do and how they help you to get through the experience. On the next slide, I've listed a few other sites of memory, memoirs. I'm very interested in dedicated websites. If you visit the Menteng Pulo site, so the cemetery in Jakarta, digitally online of the Oorlogsgraven Stichting, you can search on individual names and try searching for Verstift. And then you can click on a complete virtual environment dedicated to this Mr. Verstift who died in Kamioka. And it opens up a whole vista of information, of personal details, but the history of Indonesia, of Indo-Europeans, of the war of independence. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's a new development, I think, that we have access to these types of remembering, all elements, I think, of the network of remembrance. And all these activities and memories are bound together by narratives, by storytelling, commemorative ceremonies, reconciliation trips, and all together they form, in my opinion, the network of remembering. But also, a dialogue like this organization is a site of memory. We come together to remember, to process, to talk, to discuss, to look forward. It's very poignant. It's not just the factual, physical things, it's also the activities that we do together with others. On the next slide, briefly, this was the first reconciliation trip to Kamioka. In 1955, already, a Dutchman traveled to Kamioka to talk with the former translator, with camp guards. A lot of people were still alive at the time. And he wrote that he felt much better after the trip. And I must say that the same effect was voiced by another POW, Bob Vogler. That's quite a well-known name in some circles, a very well-known American who went to Kamioka several times. And on the next slide, you can see that this is again at the Kamioka site, recognize the stone parapet. For me also it was an unusual experience and a very healing experience, but I wasn't there alone, and I think that is the essence. I was there with Fuyoko Nishisato of the POW, Japan POW Research Network, and Mr. and Mrs. Okada, and his father was one of the former camp guards of Kamioka. And it's these meetings, I think, that are key to looking forward. In the next picture, one more picture of Mr. Sato, someone I met there as well. And this made me so interested in what actually happens during these reconciliation trips. Why do we feel better? What does it do? Does it really rewrite memories? I'm not sure. Marukami and Middleton say that what a reconciliation trip does, it changes actions and thoughts. It ties people to circumstances, past and present, materiality and morality, and it changes fixed patterns of behaviors. So where perhaps you would have regarded a Japanese person as someone to be feared, that will change through your reconciliation trip. I think it's a slightly different process. I think we actually put a new layer on top of earlier memories. I think we color earlier memories, we nuance them, we tweak them, but memories are imprinted in your system, and it's very difficult to just change them. So I think it's an ongoing process, and I think you need to meet with other people with a vested interest in moving forward. Most of all, I think it's these personal, physical encounters with others with different perspectives, different roles. This has been discussed in the earlier presentations, even from different sides, that bridge the gap, and we need to recognize each other's pain and guilt in these shared memories and create, well, a space in the present, really. Create a new site of memory where this meeting took place. And I think on the basis of that, you can turn your view to the future. There are, of course, challenges. If we go to the last slide, because I would highly recommend working through a whole network of remembrance for a particular situation or a camp or an interest you may have over a country. But of course, you need to travel. And it's a long way, and it's expensive, and it's difficult, and you need the time, the preparation, and the resources. There are physical and psychological challenges to making these long, arduous trips, certainly if you then have to travel all the way up into the mountains to 1,600 meters and you're unclear where you are. I think really languages are still a problem. It's tempting to think that DeepL and AI solve all our problems. They don't. You still don't understand what is really being said. You don't understand the culture. You don't understand the way of saying things. So I do think this is still a huge challenge. Language. Please, let's not cancel all our language courses, as the universities are doing. And finally, I think it requires ongoing engagement with sites of memory. It is not a quick fix. I haven't myself experienced that going to see certain sites, and my family's history is steeped in living in pre-war Indonesia, internment, war of independence, being interned in Japan. It's not a case of just going there and then all will be well and all your memories are fixed. You have to keep working at it. You have to keep meeting people. And I think, therefore, that is so important about this particular organization. We need to keep coming together and meeting and talking and looking to the future. This is a site of memory, and we need it to keep working on dealing with whatever memories we have. There will always be work to be done, so please, dialogue, do not stop trialogue. Thank you.
We really want to thank you for your persistence in trying to get here and sharing your experience because it's very meaningful. But I think this connects to basically everything that was shared from the dialogue sessions, that in the end it is these interpersonal connections that make a difference. And yes, there will be emotions, sometimes very raw emotions, but there are sometimes ways to move forward. And I do think that in the dialogue sessions, a lot of meaningful suggestions, ideas were shared how to do that. And there is no one way to move forward, obviously, but I do believe that having these dialogues is still important, and the fact that they were, to a certain extent, intergenerational is also very important, because this is one of the things that came up both in the lectures this morning, but also from your reports. For quite some time after the war, this notion of intergenerational trauma was dismissed. It was nothing. It did not really exist. Fortunately, more and more research has emerged, basically still being done, that this actually is a real thing, right? And so with those words, I would like to hand over to Janneke to formally close our meeting. So here you go, Janneke.
Thank you. I put this back. Yeah, thank you. So, after 25 years and a long day, we got to a full circle. And to speak with our famous writer Maria Dermout, whom you all know, 10,000 things have been seen in their unity. The question is now whether we will stay, whether we stay where we are or where we were, and continue organizing yearly conferences. Will we stop altogether because of lack of capacity, financially and human? Or do we stand at a new beginning? And that's something that we have to ponder about. So we have a lot of homework to do. All these interesting stories told over the past 25 years and research contributed to increased awareness and insight. But also what we noted today is that there's more space where we can fill in the empty spots and make new connections. And by doing so, we can create new stories. So, as I said, on our part, we have a lot of homework to do. And for now, I only want to thank you for all your support that we have received over the past so many years, and also for your hard work today, because we really made you work. So last but not least, I want to thank Wim for his excellent moderation. And I think that needs an applause. So, thank you, Wim. And let's say we will meet again one day.